Friends, today's story was sent to me by one of our subscribers, and honestly, it made my blood boil. We've all heard of Karens, but this HOA president, she was a menace on a whole new level. She thought she could use the rules to make an innocent person's life a living hell. She called the police, slapped him with a $5,000 fine, and even threatened to seize his home. But she made one colossal mistake. She didn't bother to check who truly owned the ground she stood on. When the police arrived and the property deeds came out, the nuclear revenge that unfolded, it shook the entire neighborhood. Stick around, because this tale of retribution will leave you utterly satisfied. Our story begins with our subscriber Mark. Mark is a quiet, reserved software engineer who values his privacy and his peace of mind. He lived in a charming, older home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where you'd expect to spend your weekends gardening or relaxing on the porch. But in this neighborhood, peace was a luxury because of one woman, Linda. Linda was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. She wasn't just a president, she was a dictator in a floral blouse. She spent her days patrolling the streets with a ruler and a clipboard, looking for even the slightest deviation from her strictly enforced and often arbitrary rules. To Linda, the HOA wasn't about maintaining property values. It was about power. She had a list of targets, and Mark was at the very top. It started small. One morning, Mark found a bright orange notice stuck to his front door, a $500 fine for non-standard grass color. Mark was baffled. He looked at his lawn, which was a healthy, vibrant green. Apparently, according to Linda's latest update to the bylaws, which she had passed in a meeting no one attended, the only acceptable shade was emerald forest, and Mark's grass was leaning too much towards spring meadows. The next week, it was another notice, a $1,000 fine for parking his own car in his own driveway for more than 4 hours. Linda claimed the driveway was for temporary staging only, and that cars should be hidden in the garage at all times to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the street. Mark tried to reason with her. He went to her house, hoping for a civil conversation, but Linda didn't do civil. She stood on her porch, looking down at him, and declared, "If you can't follow my rules, Mark, maybe you don't belong in this neighborhood. I've lived here for 15 years, and I won't let one person ruin our standards. I'll make sure the HOA liens your house and kicks you out of if I have to." The harassment escalated to a point that felt like a coordinated psychological attack. The final straw, however, came at the worst possible moment. Mark's mother, who had been his rock, passed away after a long illness. Mark was devastated. While he was away for 3 days organizing the funeral and grieving with his family, Linda struck. When he returned, exhausted and broken, he found a massive violation board stacked into his front yard. Not only that, but Linda had filed an official complaint against his emotional support dog, Barnaby. She claimed Barnaby barked excessively and was a public nuisance, despite the fact that Barnaby was a senior golden retriever who spent 90% of his day sleeping. She gave Mark a 24-hour ultimatum: get rid of the dog and pay a cumulative $5,000 in fines, or the HOA would begin legal proceedings to seize his property. Mark sat in his darkened living room that night, Barnaby's head resting on his knee, and he felt a cold, hard resolve settle over him. He was done playing defense. He spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of activity. He didn't argue with Linda. He didn't call the HOA office. Instead, he called his lawyer, a man who specialized in complex real estate litigation, and he started digging. What Mark discovered was a legal loophole so large you could drive a bulldozer through it. The neighborhood sat on land that had originally been a massive family estate dating back to the early 1900s. When the developers built the houses in the 90s, they had set up the HOA, but the underlying land, the actual plots, and the commercial strips nearby remained tied to a holding company that managed the original state's assets. Over the years, that company had changed hands many times and now was a neglected subsidiary of a larger investment firm that was facing bankruptcy and liquidating its assets as quickly as possible. Mark realized that while the homeowners owned their structures, the land rights, the access easement, and several key rental properties in the block, including the very house Linda lived in, were all owned by this failing company. Linda didn't own her house. She had a long-term lease with an option to buy that she had never exercised because she preferred spending her money on expensive vacations and power trips. Mark didn't hesitate. He took his life savings, combined with the substantial life insurance policy his mother had left him, and he made an aggressive cash offer to the liquidating investment firm. He didn't just buy his own plot, he bought the entire holding company. He bought the ground the neighborhood was built on. He bought the common areas, and most importantly, he bought Linda's lease. By Wednesday morning, Mark wasn't just a resident under Linda's thumb, he was the landlord of the president. The next morning, the confrontation reached its peak. Linda, seeing that Mark hadn't removed his dog or paid the fines, decided to make a public spectacle of him. She called the local police, claiming that a hostile resident was violating city ordinances and refusing to comply with legal HOA mandates. She wanted him escorted off the property. Two police officers arrived at the scene. Linda was already outside, her voice shrill and triumphant. She was pointing at Mark's house, shouting, "Officer, arrest him! He hasn't paid the fines. His dog is a threat to the community, and he is disrespecting the authority of this association. He needs to learn that rules are rules." The officers approached Mark's door just as he was stepping out. He looked incredibly calm, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a thick blue legal folder in the other. Linda was smirking behind the officers, her arms crossed, waiting for the handcuffs to come out. "Is there a problem, officers?" Mark asked politely. "We have a complaint about unpaid fines and a public nuisance, sir," one officer said, looking a bit tired of Linda's shouting. Mark nodded slowly. "I see. Well, before we go any further, I think you should take a look at these." He handed the folder to the lead officer. "Specifically, please look at page 4, the property deeds and the corporate transfer of assets. You see, I'm the sole owner of the holding company that owns the land beneath this entire HOA jurisdiction. That makes me the primary stakeholder of the association's assets." The officer's eyes widened as he flipped through the notarized documents. Linda's smirk began to fade. "What are you talking about?" she spat. "That's a lie. You're just a software nerd with a dying lawn." Mark ignored her and looked directly at the officer. "Furthermore, officer, please look at the lease agreement for 142 Maple Drive. That's Linda's residence. It's a commercial to residential lease held by my new company. I've spent the last 24 hours auditing the HOA books, which I now have the legal right to do as a landowner. It appears Linda has been using the HOA emergency fund to pay her personal legal fees and credit card bills. That is a direct violation of her tenant contract." Mark then turned to face Linda. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked like she was about to faint. "Linda," Mark said, his voice cold and steady, "as your new landlord, I am officially terminating your lease effective immediately for breach of contract and illegal use of funds. You aren't the president anymore because the HOA is currently being dissolved due to gross mismanagement. You have exactly 3 days to pack your things and vacate the premises. If you aren't gone by then, I will have the sheriff department remove you for trespassing." The police officer closed the folder and looked at Linda. Ma'am, he's absolutely right. This is a civil matter of property ownership, and these documents are verified. You are currently on his property. I suggest you go inside and start packing. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Mark had ever heard. Linda tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came out. She realized in that moment that her reign of terror was over. She wasn't just losing her power, she was losing her home. Within 48 hours, the news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. When the other residents found out that Linda had been embezzling their hard earned dues to fund her lifestyle, the outrage was deafening. The HOA was dissolved in an emergency meeting, and for the first time in a decade, people felt like they actually owned their homes again. Linda was seen 3 days later, frantically loading boxes into a rusted U-Haul truck, while the neighbors she had once bullied watched from their porches with satisfied smiles. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a broken woman who had finally met the consequences of her own actions. Mark kept his house exactly the way he liked it. He kept Barnaby, who lived out his final years napping in the sun on a lawn that was whatever shade of green Mark felt like making it. He didn't want to be the new president. He just wanted to be left alone. And in the end, he got exactly what he wanted. If you love this story of nuclear revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever dealt with a power hungry HOA or a neighbor who thought they owned the street? How did you handle it? Let us know, and your story might be the next one we feature on the channel. Thanks for watching.